name is Andy Telekowski. I am the Programs Administrator here at Mechanics Institute, and I am delighted to welcome you to what I'm sure will be a captivating conversation with acclaimed authors Jenny Odell and Cathy Park Hong. Can I get a raise of hands of who is here at Mechanics Institute for the first time? Fabulous, welcome! For those of you who are new, Mechanics Institute is a historic membership library and chess room founded in 1854 that offers a wide range of cultural and educational events, including author events, writers and readers groups, film screenings, and community gatherings. I invite you all to join us for our weekly building tour that are Wednesdays at noon. And you are also welcome to come to our upcoming evening tour, which is going to be Friday, September 13th at 5 p.m. Now, can I also get a raise of hands for our members? Fabulous, thank you to our ongoing members. For those of you who want to learn a bit more about the benefits of Mechanics Institute membership, you are more than welcome to speak with me, Laura Shepard, our Director of Events, and Nico Chen, who is our Writing and Literary Programs Manager, after the event. As you may have seen coming in, we do have a book sales table right on the outside. You are welcome to purchase a book after the event, and Jenny and Cathy will be there to do signings. I am now excited to introduce our speakers for tonight, Jenny Odell and Cathy Park Hong. Jenny Odell is an Oakland-based artist and the author of the books How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy, and Saving Time, Discovering a Life Beyond the Clock. Odell previously taught studio art at Stanford University and has been an artist in residence at Recology SF, otherwise known as the Dump, the Internet Archive, and the San Francisco Planning Department. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, and the Paris Review. Cathy Park Hong's New York Times bestselling book of creative nonfiction, Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning, was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Autobiography, and earned her recognition on Time's 100 Most Influential People of 2021. She is also the author of poetry collections Engine Empire, Dance Dance Revolution, and Translating Mohun. Hong is the recipient of the Wyndham Campbell Prize, the Guggenheim Fellowship, and the National Endowments for the Art Fellowship. Her prose and poetry have been published in the New York Times, New Republic, The Guardian, Paris Review, Poetry, and elsewhere. She is a professor of English at UC Berkeley. Please join me in welcoming Jenny Odell and Cathy Park Hong. On? Okay, great. Hi. I was going to read a little bit from Saving Time, and then we'll have a conversation afterwards. Just to kind of set up what I'm going to read, the kind of structure of the book is, the different chapters explore different ways of thinking about and talking about time. So in the first half, there's a lot about time is money, and the kind of cultural, historical roots of that, which are very upsetting. And then so towards the second half of the book, I start looking at alternatives, other ways of thinking about time, other languages for time. So the two little excerpts that I'm going to read are from chapter 6, which is really the one that's taking that idea of time reckoning as a language the most seriously. And also I should say that the part of the argument I'm trying to make in this chapter is that even though time is money is kind of the lingua franca of how we think about time, it never became fully dominant. It never fully succeeded in totally colonizing the way we think about time. Just because a language is imposed, it doesn't mean it can be controlled. And just because it's spoken, it doesn't mean it's been internalized. Although native reservations in the United States were overseen by white agents well into the 20th century, with traditional dancing typically restricted, the Lakota figured out in the 1920s that they could hold extensive dances on the 4th of July if they did it under the banner of patriotism.
When this tactic worked, it spread throughout the northern and southern plains with petitions for dances on New Year's Day, Washington's and Lincoln's birthdays, Memorial Day, Flag Day, and Veterans Day. In his book, Indian Blues, John Troutman quotes Severitt Young Bear. The agents thought those weren't dangerous occasions, so we got to dance. These supposedly nationalist celebrations appeared dangerous, Troutman writes, only, quote, when agents realized they could not contain the symbolism of the holiday that they wished the Lakotas to observe. There's something deeply funny about this story. It has the element of an inside joke, meaningful only to the Lakota and not to those less savvy agents who flattered themselves with the incredible idea that Indians would want to celebrate the 4th of July. Under the temporal and spatial surveillance of Indian agents, the Lakota were able to find an interstitial hiding space within the vicissitudes of language. This kind of adaptation has appeared over and over again, illustrated more recently by the Chinese citizens who used a mixture of homonyms, images, and sarcasm to evade Chinese internet censors in the 2010s. An inside joke makes a new inside, a new center. If the state relies on intelligibility, the inside joke is a way of becoming simultaneously unintelligible to the overseer and mutually intelligible within a group. This kind of inside contains its own center. In a 2004 study of the relationship between task orientation and wage labor on the Pine Ridge Reservation, Kathleen Pickering cautions us not to view Lakota temporal practices as mere resistance. She writes that Lakota constructions of time are about more than the Lakota's place in relation to Euro-Americans. They are about Lakota society itself. For example, in the 20th century, being used to a task-oriented society, some Lakota actually thought the idea that time is money implied laziness, quote, because it limited work to only 8 hours per day, regardless of whether the work is done. Pickering quotes a Lakota elder. Time was never a specific minute, but rather spaces of time, like early morning, just after noon, or just before midnight. The real meaning of Indian time comes from Nake Nula Waung Yelo, a phrase in traditional songs that means, I'm ready for whatever, any place, always prepared. Far from internalizing the Euro-American work ethic, the Lakota on the Pine Ridge Reservation observe and engage in wage labor only to the extent that it is necessary. To not see mere resistance here requires the Western viewer to try to be something other than, as Fred Moten calls it, the settler who brings the center with them, as them, everywhere they go. One helpful illustration of this comes at the end of The Colonization of Time. That's a really amazing book that I quote a lot here. Nani writes that in 1977, a local town council erected a giant electrically operated clock in the middle of a remote Australian town. The town's inhabitants were mostly Pitjantjara and had no need for clock time. Thus, the tower went unheated. Quote, ironically, a white community worker pointed out a decade later that the clock was simply a waste of time. The fact is, the same person explained, that nobody looks at it. The clock has not been working for months. No one knew that it was not working. This brings me back to Filipino time. From one angle, the term looks derogatory, given that it was coined by the Americans who took over the Philippines at the turn of the century and who found Filipino people to be less than punctual. Still, it's often invoked as a sort of inside joke or even a wry point of pride, at least among people I know. When a recent memorial service that my mom attended started late, my cousin said, what do you expect? It's a Filipino church. A Medium post by Brian Tan, a product designer in the Philippines, exemplifies the view that Filipino time has outlived its welcome. His reasoning has to do with how it looks to the outside world, with its modern Zeitgeber. Zeitgeber is a German word for like a pacemaker, a time giver. Modern Zeitgebers and productivity ethos. There was the risk that lateness would become, quote, the brand of our people and our country, a serious disadvantage. I get it. Zerubbabel wrote that observance of time systems, like any language, is what allows us to participate in an intersubjective world. And the broadest intersubjective world right now is a global capitalist one. But if, just for a moment, we leave behind historically and culturally specific notions of clock-based punctuality and time as money, then Filipino time actually doesn't appear to be a problem at all. If you and everyone you know are on it, then it's just time. And then the second bit that I'll read is towards the end of this chapter. It's after, I'm talking to a friend who's in her 70s and she is trying to give me lettuce because she needs to take leaves out off the outside of the plant for it to keep growing, and it sort of breaks my brain that she could give me something and she'll have more of it. And then at the same time, she's also planting these beans that she gave away to friends like 20 years ago, doesn't remember where they're from, and they planted them, and some of them gave them back to her. And so we're talking about this kind of like non-zero sum game, which is also very hard for me to wrap my mind around. And so that happens, and now I'm sitting in a botanical garden thinking about this. Time can have many rhythms, and rhythms can take on many meanings. Writing about the demoralization of work through processes like Taylorism, sociologist Richard Sennett has observed that routine can demean, but it can also protect. Routine can decompose labor, but can also compose a life. It can be the construction of ritual, the way that the Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel called the Sabbath a palace that we build in time. The garden represented one set of gardeners' views about what kinds of arrangements would make up a harmonious whole, and visitors lingered in the parts that they liked. While it wasn't a large space, the garden was dense, a space not just of biodiversity, but of chronodiversity, inviting the human subject into conversations with different modes and speeds of life. Here, it was not only clear that time was not money, but that the category of not money could be infinitely elaborated. Would it be possible not to save and spend time, but to garden it, by saving, inventing, and stewarding different rhythms of life? And wouldn't this simply be an acknowledgement of the use of the chronodiversity that already exists for all of us on some level, individually or communally? The sociologist Barbara Adam, who has written about standardized economic time, also knows that its dominance is as incomplete as it is unintuitive. Quote, "Tempo and intensity surround us at every level. We know that a birthday tomorrow can feel like an eternity to a little child, while a birthday 1 year ago can seem like only yesterday to an old person. The dormant period of winter is followed by a burst of growth in spring. Our social time, as it emerges from common usage, is inseparable from the rhythms of the earth. Complexity reigns supreme." If time can be gardened, then it's also possible to imagine its increase in ways other than individual hoarding. Before I left my friend's garden, she gave me some scarlet runner beans from a bean farm that no longer exists. They're now sitting on a metal shelf next to the store-bought beans that Joe and I, like many other people, started stocking up on during the pandemic. I've had so much time to look at and think about beans, but I had never considered what they actually were. I Googled, "Can you plant store-bought beans?" and the answer was yes. Those things in the bags, they weren't just commodities. Sure, you could eat them, but they weren't endpoints and they weren't dead. At least some of them contained something, the possibility of future beans. As I told more friends about this story, it became an inside joke, a new familect. Familect is like a term for a word that becomes part of your vocabulary with a small group. An inside joke, a new familect. Time is not money, time is beans. It was as serious as many jokes are, which is to say, about half. Saying it meant that you could take time and give time, but also that you could plant time and grow more of it, and that there were different varieties of time. It meant that all your time grew out of someone else's time, maybe out of something someone planted long ago. It meant that time was not the currency of a zero-sum game, and that sometimes the best way for me to get more time would be to give it to you, and the best way for you to get some would be to give it back to me. If time were not a commodity, then time, our time, would not be as scarce as it seemed just a moment ago. Together, we could have all the time in the world.
Hi. Hello. Hi. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you to the Campus Institute. I was looking forward to this conversation with Jenny, whose books I admire a lot, and I think about this a lot. I feel like we the same authors. I think about productivity and the attention economy and time quite a bit, and I'm always thinking about how the ways in which I can use language to slow it down and so forth. So I thought maybe that's something that we could sort of discuss. And before I do that, I wanted to read a little section of Minor Feelings, which is called Bad English, which was, basically it's about bad English. It echoes off a little bit of what Jenny was reading here, and I'll just read just a couple passages, very short passages, just the beginning and somewhere else. And it was when I was growing up, sort of learning to speak English. I had a special, almost erotic relationship with my stationery when I was young. I collected stationery items the way other kids collect dolls or action figures. Really, I must buy a pencil, Virginia Woolf said, without warning, before rushing out the door to begin her peregrination throughout the wintry streets of London. I would have related to her urgency. I too felt passionately for the lead pencil, as long as it was thin, lavender, mechanical pencils, with a Hello Kitty bauble clasped to the tip with a delicate silver chain. And erasers too, scented raspberry or vanilla, molded into plump, pastel, wall-eyed Sanrio critters. I adored my erasers so much I had to repress the urge to bite off their heads. I was careful at first, gently brushing the bob feet against my notebook. But once my eraser was spoiled with graphite, I ruthlessly rubbed away my errors until all that remained was a gray, dusty nub of face and one sad punctuation of an I. For some reason, I was a target in church camp, where the Korean girls my age ostracized me out of their room, claiming all the beds, saying they were taken even if they were not. So I was forced to bunk with the younger girls in the next room. One early morning, I was betrayed by my beloved stationery. I opened up my Hello Kitty diary, which I had left unlocked, and saw that someone had inscribed on the first page in neat cursive that must have been written with a mechanical pencil, "Kitty, go home." English was always borrowed, from hip-hop to Spanglish to The Simpsons. Early on, my father learned that in America, one must be emotionally demonstrative to succeed. So he had a habit of saying, "I love you," indiscriminately, to his daughters, to his employees, to his customers, and to airline personnel. He must have observed a salesman affectionately slapping another salesman on the back while saying, "Love you, man. Good to see you." But because there is no fraternizing man or slap on the back, his usage has an indelicate intimacy, especially since he quietly unloads endearment as a burning confession. "Thanks for getting those orders in," he'll say, before hanging up the phone. "Oh, and Kirby, I love you." Now I'm going to skip ahead where I talk about just sort of using the bad English that I learned growing up and using that in my poetry. It was once a source of shame, but now I say it proudly. Bad English is my heritage. I share a literary lineage with writers who make the unmastering of English their rallying cry, who queer it, twerk it, hack it, Calvinize it, other it by hijacking English and warping it to a fugitive tongue. To other English is to make audible the imperial power sewn into the language, to slit English open so its dark history slide out. In the essay Other, From Noun to Verb, the poet Nathaniel Mackey draws a distinction between the noun other, which is social, and the verb other, which is artistic. Artistic othering has to do with innovation, invention, and change, upon which cultural health and diversity depend and thrive. Social othering has to do with power, exclusion, and privilege. The centralizing of a noun against which otherness is measured, meted out, marginalized. My focus is the practice of the former by people subjected to the latter. So I'm just going to stop there. I think we should just go on ahead with the conversation. Maybe I'll just jump ahead, just leap in with the first question. I was really, I love those passages from the book. Funny enough, I was like, I started reading big time when this June when I was in Korea. And and I thought your book was really appropriate to my time in Seoul, because it's like, I like to think of Korea, when I think about Korea, it's like, it's experiencing capitalism in dog years. It's like, in that it's like compressed capitalism, so it's almost like it's like guinea pigs of what is all the consequences of way capitalism happens to Korea first, and then it happens to the US like 10 years later, 5 to 10 years later. So like whatever trade. So like, from anything from a gig economy to selfies. Where the selfies were happening in Korea before it was happening in the US. And now, now I'm seeing, like, people are, it's actually a really cool place. I don't mean to just talk about the negative parts, but anyway, people are working from 50-hour workdays, 6 days a week, and, it has the lowest birth rate in the world and the highest suicide rate among developed countries. But I think what's fascinating about it is like talking to all these young feminists in Korea, where they were opting out of having families, having sex, dating, boyfriends, husbands of any sort. They have opted out of sex altogether, and same thing with men as well. So you have two genders that are like these two widespread incel cultures, and I was just, and I think part of that has to do with also because they can't survive, so if they can't survive, they can't live, capitalism is completely smothered out relations between the two sexes, there isn't really, but I was like, I'm still interested in seeing, okay, where the queer community is coming within that space. But I think, what's fascinating to me when I was there is, there was one person who told me, yeah, I heard a friend who said, I don't have sex because sex is inefficient, and so, and so that was like, I was like, oh, that's so sad. But I'm seeing it also here, maybe where these are just studies, I don't know, I don't like, do ask questions to my students or anything like that. It's not like that. I have read studies that younger people are having less sex and but there is less because of climate dread and everything. One of the many reasons that they're declining from having families and marriage and so forth. But I think what's really interesting is how late capitalism has got productivity has gone to such extremes that it has completely smothered the biological imperative, humanity's need to reproduce and everything. And I see it really happening in Korea. Not to be so negative about it, but so I was reading your book. I was like, these thoughts were going through my mind, and I was just thinking, this is very, like what you were saying was very consonant to what I was experiencing looking in Korea. And I was really enjoying the alternative solutions, but it's a very long-winded question. But I was wondering if you could talk about the sort of your, the ways in which, I love that term garden, how these, if you could talk a little bit more of your, like the alternative sort of solutions, or maybe not solutions, models are another way of thinking about it. Especially maybe focused on writing itself, how writing can be a mode of existence, resistance, I mean, and also resistance, but also how writing can be a way to garden time.
Yeah. So your question makes me think about Blinkist. Does anyone here know about Blinkist? Do you know about Blinkist? Blinkist is like I don't know if it's an app. It's definitely like a website you can go to. It's a startup version of Cliff Notes. It's like, do you not have time to read this book? You go to Blinkist, and then it just kind of like lays out all the points for you. There is a Blinkist for how to do nothing. Yeah. There might be one for saving time. I shouldn't say that because then you'll just go read that and you won't buy the book. Obviously there's something really funny about a Blinkist version of how to do nothing, but it did like invite you to reflect on, the sort of, why my writing is the shape that it is, or the sort of, the inefficiency of it. Because there's this idea that you could boil something down to an essence that you could extract more quickly, more efficiently, and somehow that's the same or that's as valuable. I think maybe it's worth mentioning, like I also have a visual arts background, and for me, like the aesthetics of something and the context of something are totally inseparable from the meaning and the content of it. And so I think there's something about the type of essay that I like and that I try to write that's very, quote unquote, inefficient in that it's taking the time to look at something from sort of every possible angle, and also clearly the person writing it does not know the answer at the beginning. So it's not like I read all these books about time and then I'm gonna distill them down into these bullet points so that you can get all that information faster, and that's the service that I'm providing to you. Whereas I think, I'm trying to write in the way of sort of, the book sort of literally laid out as a map. It's like, I have a starting point, you're here with me in the starting point, and I actually don't know where this is going, and we're gonna take the time to figure out where we are and get oriented and really zoom out from things that we take for granted.
It's that kind of, I'm thinking of this poet and Jillian and their idea of the open text, and I often feel quite inefficient as a writer myself, and I try to think of it as as a strength rather than as a weakness. And I think that's why I love when I write poetry and I teach poetry, I often praise the inefficiency in poetry and how it's always in the margins, and it's perhaps of all the forms, it's the most anti-capitalist. When I go to a party, I used to be really self-conscious about this, where people would ask, what do you do? And I'd say, I'm a poet. And inevitably, the second question would be, no, what do you really do? What do you really do? So so I was thinking that when I was thinking of your book, it's like we're so kind of inculcated in this kind of era of frenetic doing, and doing means, having some kind of income revenue, or just if you're not doing unless you have some kind of income, and therefore with poetry, I'm not doing. It's not what I'm doing is not poetry, because I'm not actually making a salary off of it. I can't actually capitalize off of poetry, and I think that's also its strength, right? Is the fact that it exists in the margins and that it can't be marketable, and because of that, it's inefficient. But because of that, people are almost scornful of it. They get almost indignant, well, how could you be into poetry when no one actually reads it? And it's also, you can't understand it. This also goes back to sort of the different ways that you read. I think with especially reading now, we want writing to be as transparent as possible, so that when we read it, we forget it immediately. We kind of we get the little information bites, and that's it.
Yeah, I always found that attitude towards poetry really funny, because it's also because there are fewer words, somehow it's less productive. It's literally a numbers thing. And I remember when I was in undergrad, I took actually John Chapta's poetry class, and I was I remember thinking, oh, this will be easier because it's fewer words. That's what I thought. And then actually it's way harder. But I love poetry for that reason, and I feel like it's an example of something where I almost think of it in terms of frame rate, people having a frame rate, and if something's too if something can't appear in that frame rate, it just gets totally swept aside, right? Someone who needs to know what a sentence means and is pointing to within a fraction of a second is not going to spend time on poetry. And then the remaining group of people who still will are so rewarded for the time that they do spend. Art is similar, art that asks you to actually look at it for, again, more than a millisecond. And this might just be naive of me, but I feel there is underneath the industry sort of like the going wisdom for marketing, which is that everyone has a really short attention span. Everyone immediately needs to know what it is. Like, this is my big gripe about subtitles, nonfiction subtitles, which are very much playing into that. Like, people need to immediately know exactly what this is because they have no patience. That I think that may be true on some level, but I think that underneath that there is actually quite a desire for like something like a little bit deeper than that, something that actually like moves you and changes you and makes you meet it in the middle, or something that you take with you and apply it to your life in some way that like actually we're quite starved of this, and so like people really respond to it when they see it. Again, not everyone, but like I don't think that, I mean that's what I am doing, and that there is like some audience for it, so that's just, I don't know, but that could be wishful thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. I definitely see, and that does exist, right? That kind of different forms of engagement, and I think that like, you know, what writing offers. I mean, when you think about like online, what we absorb online, the content we absorb online, or what tech companies really kind of isolate is, isolate is the optics. Everything is optical. Everything is about the image. Everything you just like prioritize seeing, whereas like writing is about kind of encompassing all the senses, you know, and all the senses. And this is what you know, a writing can do, and also what art can do. And especially when you're engaging it live, you know, there's this one. There was this writer who said, I'm forgetting his name, but like, you know, the most radical kind of art is a kind of art that brings groups of people who would normally be in the same room together, you know, and I think that is sort of offers to kind of the way we think, the way we live algorithmically, you know, where it's like, where likeness is paired with likeness. I was, you know, I was thinking about maybe we could talk a little bit about art, you know, because I think we have the same kind of background, right? Like I've always been really interested in art. I wanted to be an artist when I was in college, and I didn't even try to fail. You know, I didn't even get to the point of failing. I just sort of stopped. I was like, no, I'm not going to be good at this. But I've always had this, like, you know, I love, you know, my partner's an artist. You know, my closest friends are artists, and I'm very much interested in art, in what art is doing, and that always inspired my own writing. And you got your MFA in art, and maybe you could. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how it impacts your writing.
Yeah, so I went to San Francisco Art Institute, RIP, and I did a lot of work with like Google Maps, like cutting out parking lots from satellite imagery and arranging them. There was just a lot of, I think I had an obsession already with like zooming in and zooming out of things, which I think knowing that you can sort of like see it in my writing. But also I did a lot of collage, and I still actually make collages just like, weirdly I think of it as a writing practice. Like I'm just making like standard collages for magazines. I don't show them to anyone, but the process of doing them is I'm doing it for whatever it is that I'm writing at the time. In part because because I have the collage background and I'm bringing that to nonfiction, I just naturally want to take little pieces of things and put them sort of in a strange arrangement, which everyone does to some degree, but it's funny because like I've read some reviews of Saving Time where they're like, it has like all this like this crazy number of references, like all in like 2 paragraphs, and I'm like, I didn't think that was a crazy number of references. I thought that was normal. But that's just kind of I think that's again the sort of like collage impulse. But it also comes from I get really bored with linear, like kind of formulaic nonfiction. I just can't read it. Or I can't, but I don't like knowing where things are going. Like I would prefer to not know where things are going at any given moment. And I also like, as a viewer, and also as a reader of that kind of writing, but as a viewer of a collage, I like, for instance, one of my favorite collages is a 5 foot wide collage by an artist who just went by Jess. And it's mostly magazine pieces, but it's also like a piece of tapestry, it's got puzzle pieces, it has probably thousands of pieces in it, but it has a kind of, there is a figure in a foreground and a background, and it sort of visually makes sense. But I like my agency and sort of being able to walk around, choose the different parts to look at, make those connections for myself, the associations that I have with each piece, and the kind of like compromise between like obviously the intentions that the artist had and kind of putting those things there for me, but also the freedom that was left to me to be able to construct some kind of meaning out of it. And so that's very much, in my writing, and I think, it's frustrating for some people because it's not telling you, it's not bringing you on a single path, it's not sort of pointing the way very directly, it's kind of like, it can kind of feel a bit like, here's a bunch of stuff. But I think that I prefer to put a lot of trust in the reader to assemble meanings that are more complex and personal than you would be able to do in just kind of the straight line.
Okay, if you have a question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I could, well, actually, let me, I could just riff off that. I mean, yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think, like, in terms of the essay, like, the origins of the essay it's very much, like, the origins of an essay is that it's supposed to be an experiment, right? And it's like, so it's, the origins of it is that it's kind of an assemblage of different ideas. And it's like, what I love about the essay is that it's so capacious. And you can think of, like, you could just sort of incorporate so many different bodies of knowledge in there, and I think that was why I was really drawn to it as a poet, where each paragraph was like a stanza for me, and in a way, like the way I write essays, and I actually, it's true, people resist it, but also I think there is this kind of popularization of essays that are nonlinear, like as essays that move sort of more metonymically rather than like, just more chronologically or any kind of linear progression, like I think Person Owls and Claudia Rankine, or a lot of people who've been influenced by like Roland Barthes and so forth. And, so there is that. So I think there are people who are resistant to that, but then I think it's interesting that there is this sort of more of an interest in that kind of lateral thinking too, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I really enjoyed that in Minor Feelings, like just because like I said, that's how I prefer to read, and I like the feeling that you're in good hands, or you're like in interesting hands. Like when you read an essay and it's like there's like a paragraph about something, and then there's like something else unexpected, and something else unexpected, but that it's all going to be connected in some way, and that you'll sort of be a part of that process of making the connection. And I also feel like, I feel like those connections that I, make as the reader feel so much more genuine than being told something. It's more interesting, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, actually, I wanted to ask about. Can I ask you about stand-up?
Sure.
So there's a part of Minor Feelings where you talk about doing stand-up as opposed to poetry readings.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like I am just interested in obviously like sort of non-standard formats, or like sort of formats for writing. Or presenting writing.
That was like really, I think I was inspired. Well, I was inspired by stand-up and also visual art, right? I was really interested in the way performance artists are able to sort of disrupt these kind of institutionalized spaces, especially these white spaces that have inherited histories of white bodies in that space. So that, and I always felt that when I was doing poetry readings, and when I was first emerging as a poet, I think like the landscape has gotten much more diversified. But when I first started reading in my 20s, my early 30s, to do a poetry reading in a bar or event space or a library or whatever, it was like all white people, and it really, and the energy was just really, it was like all the cliches you hear about poetry. It felt like church. It was really boring, and I couldn't, and I felt like I was fighting against that sort of inherited white space. Where I was not only stuck in church, but I was also participating in church, you know, and I wanted to kind of break out of that role. And that's why I was really attracted to stand-up, you know. I think that was why I was really attracted to humor, which is, you know, and in particular Richard Pryor, because Richard Pryor was this comedian who used stand-up comedy as a sort of trapdoor to the ugly truths of race in America. And I was always like struggling with like, how do you get people to listen to or read or understand what's ugly about America? You know, the kind of indigenous genocides, anti-black racism, anti-Asian racism, all of that, you know. And I was like, and I really was, it was revelatory when I saw Richard Pryor at the time. So I was, at the time, I was in a really kind of masochistic state of mind, and so, and I was also having writer's block, so that what I did was I transcribed all of this comedy. You know, talk about slow. I did fiction. That's what I did. And so I was like, I would listen. Now there's an app for that, right? It's like you can transcribe. I was like, no, I'm not gonna. I didn't like, you know, of course when you have an app that transcribes everything, you're not gonna memorize it. You're not gonna learn it. And it was like, there was this way where I wanted to just sort of understand his language, understand sort of what he was trying to do by transcribing all of his comedy, his audio and performance, and then I was like, it was like all these like failed attempts. I think what also attracted me to stand-up was that it like failure is part of the practice of stand-up comedy. You only get good through the process of failure, and that's what I wanted to. And I was really, as an Asian person who was so deathly afraid of failure, and also feeling like a failure at the same time, but not being able to show that I was a failure. It was really exhilarating to see stand-up because I was like, oh, I'm just going to expose myself and just show and just really show that I'm a failure. You know, it seemed more, I don't know, somehow it seemed more empowering, I guess. So instead of doing these poetry readings, just for a brief period of time, when the book came out, people assumed that I actually was a stand-up comedian. I was never a stand-up comedian. I don't know where. No, it was just a few times where I did these readings where instead of doing a poetry reading, I would just sort of do a bait and switch and do like tell jokes instead in front of the paper, and people didn't know how to react. They thought, like, they looked at me as if I peed in my pants, and I don't know why I was doing it, but I think I was trying to sort of disrupt whatever this like very kind of congealed poetry reading space was, to see what it was, what I could do with it, because I was so, I was, you know, I think I was burnt out by it. And that was, you know, kind of part of the long process that led up to Minor Feelings, or Minor Feelings, I like to say, is a palimpsest of failed mediums, you know, where I tried writing these poems that directly address race, you know, as poetry, as a novel, these little kind of performance bits, and finally it turned into this book of essays. So it's also a sort of collage. It's collage. I also love collage. When I was making art, it was like kind of a collage of my past failures, which always, you know, if you're a writer, nothing is actually a failure. You can always plagiarize yourself, you know, or cannibalize yourself, whatever verb you want to use. You always cannibalize yourself. It always comes back, and you can always like patch it to something later, you know. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I found that very inspiring, because I too have felt burned out, and as I've said already, I get sort of very bored by formulaic things, and just this sort of notion of finding some other way in to the same thing. I feel like I'm always kind of looking for that, and sometimes it's like right there in front of you, but it's just because it's assumed that you're going to do it this particular way, it sort of walls everything off. And I think that is also in some ways related to what I think we both have done in our books, which is to like take something that's been so written about, or that you yourself have tried to write about, and like attack it from multiple angles, or zoom out, bring historical context into it, or just bring like other information into it, and then return to the experience. If that's something that I am very obsessed with. It's the reason that I structured the book as an out and back road trip. So the chapters are set in different places. It's a feasible one-day road trip in the Bay Area. You start in Oakland and you return to Oakland because it's that feeling of being back, sort of in the back in the same place, but you're seeing what you didn't see before, and you're also seeing how you didn't see it before and all the reasons why you didn't. And it's a very uncanny feeling because you're like, I'm the same person, and this is the same place, and yet it appears totally different to me. And I've also had, like, your book did this for me, like other books, I describe them as like you read a book and you have to go sit on a bench somewhere and rethink your entire life. It's like that kind of like the return, and then there could be further returns, like, as you get older and you get more context. But I just really, I really love that kind of circling back.
And I think, I also love that sense of return too. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more actually of this idea of kind of structuring your book as a road trip, and like if you could expand on that a little bit more. Yeah.
So that idea actually didn't come until about halfway through writing the book, and it was inspired by two things. One was I started playing the most recent at the time Zelda, and it was my first like real video game that I ever played, which is crazy because it's like an amazing work of art, and I wasn't allowed to play video games as a kid. So I was very new to the idea of or the experience of playing through a spatialized story. So like things only happen in certain places. There is sometimes the experience of coming back to the same place, but now you have like new armor. I don't know, something like that. You have like new abilities. So I was playing that in part actually because I was feeling really burned out. Like I needed to do something else and have this is like during the pandemic. I needed to have some other experience of just kind of like wandering around and not trying to make anything. And so that was very helpful for that. And then the other experience I had was I was visiting a small town with actually the partner of the person who was giving me the lettuce. And we went on this really long walk, and they've been living there for 50 years. They're in their 70s. So he was telling me all of these amazing stories about the town and also about things in his life. And later, when I was trying to remember those, I just had to go on the walk again in my head. And of course, it's like a really, time-honored, like sort of method of remembering, or individual or collective remembering, is to assign things to places. And so that was kind of the initial reason behind deciding to even format it like that at all. And then I knew that I wanted it to be an out and back, so it starts in the Oakland port, because the first chapter is about time is money and standardization. So there's a park called Middle Harbor Shoreline Park where you can see on the one hand the kind of migratory flock of birds, and then you turn around and you see all the shipping containers and the cranes and all of that. And then the second chapter is in a traffic jam on 880 because it's about individual time management and sort of zero-sum game, thinking like if that person gets ahead, I fall behind. The leisure chapter is at the Stanford Shopping Center, and the Foothill Park, which used to be open to residents only. The chapter about time and space kind of being one and the same is at Pescadero, so it's sort of about geological time. Climate Dread chapter is in Pacifica, of the part of Pacifica that's eroding. And then the chapter that I read from is set in the Prellinger Library, community library. The last chapter is at the Chapel of the Chimes, which is in Oakland, because that chapter is about death. So yeah, it's like this kind of like trying to, and when I say I set it in a place, there's just these kind of paragraphs throughout the chapter that are addressing you directly, as if you are with me in my high school era car from 2003 that still has all of my high school CDs in it, and that's our sort of vehicle for the trip. And I'm describing the things that we're looking at and trying to make the ideas that I'm talking about in the chapter concretely visible through like the physical details of what we're looking at. Yeah. But yeah, it was really fun. I don't know, I feel like it gave me like a it allowed me to sort of experiment more than if I had just tried to do it in a more like, I don't know, standard order.
Yeah. It's you know, it's like this kind of spatialization of your ideas about time. And I think thinking about the book and how your book and how it was also kind of started during the pandemic, and you know, we all sort of want to. You know, I've heard so many times people say, "Oh, those years, 2020, 2023 didn't matter. You know, those were lost years," and so forth. But you know, there has been this like, you know, there has been some literature about the pandemic that has come out, and a lot of literature that has come out about the pandemic is this reflection on time. You know, time seems to be the main subject, and I thought about time a lot as well. And for me, like during the pandemic, the way I kind of tried to deal with it as a writer, I wasn't really able to. I was actually on Zoom a lot because that was when Minor Feelings came out, and there was also all this anti-Asian hate, and I was being asked to talk about it a lot, and it was actually a very stressful time, and also an exhilarating time. But I was also not experiencing it, engaging it with real people. You know, so it was like the opposite of doing the poetry reading, where I was engaging with all these people, but it was all on my laptop. But you know, I don't know. I'm just spitballing here, but like you know, when I was thinking about it is interesting to think about how memory, you know, how memory operated during that time, you know, that time period, because it's like, you know, for a lot of people, they say it was just like this blur of Zoom meetings, or for those who are fortunate to have white collar jobs versus being on the front line. And there was something about memory, you know, where it's like, there's like, you need space to carve out memory, right? Whereas if you're just in your room and you're engaging with people online, there's a real kind of collapse of time and space where it doesn't stick. Nothing ever sticks. And so I think that was really kind of troubling for a lot of people, the way it's like you're talking about different temporalities, right? And the pandemic was like, it's fascinating. I mean, in a way, it just like, it took the grind, it like ground the grind to a halt, right? And then but for others, either you were like bounced off the train, or you were in the train and the train was like going off the rails, you know? And I think it's like, it really, you know, and I think your book is a fascinating example of a book that has come out during that period to really kind of introspectively explore what time is and what it means to be productive and so forth. Have we learned from it? I don't know. I don't think so. Maybe that's something we could also talk about. It's also like since then, have you revised any of your thoughts that you had when you were writing Saving Time?
Okay. Yeah, I think to me, like the relationship between how I experienced time during the pandemic and time now is that I feel like I learned how to do something out of just like kind of like a survival instinct, which is because of what you're describing, that sameness. I think I describe it in the book as like time was like a series of boxes to be filled in my box of a room forever and ever. Like there were all those tweets about like, it's March 37th, like these jokes about how like time is just completely undifferentiated. And I found that and I write about this in that chapter, that I needed to like really go, you know, even if it was just like the park 15 minutes from my house, and like I picked a buckeye tree and I picked a branch on that buckeye tree to pay attention to, and then just every single day. And I would go and like, you know, it's a California buckeye tree, so it goes dormant in the summer, but you know, in the spring, day by day, it's actually quite different. Like there's one set of leaves that opens, there's another set of leaves that open. They're really shiny at the beginning. They become sort of waxy and like floppy at a certain point. The flower stalk opens, but it's a flower stalk, so there's many little buds. Like maybe one day there's 3 of them that are open. Maybe one day there's 7 of them that are open. Then you have the smell, and there's just kind of like procession of events, right? And I really sort of grabbed onto that because I needed a palpable illustration that time was actually moving forward. I think maybe a lot of my friends had children in 2020, and I think that when I would occasionally see their children, that was like another marker. It's like, wow, they're so different. You know, I think that time really is going forward. And even though, you know, you're not stuck with that sameness of time anymore, like I still really hold on to that kind of thing that I learned how to do out of necessity. I still really try to make sure that I am connected in some way to observing those real like palpable changes that are happening that cannot be explained by like a calendar, like a standard calendar.
Yeah, I think we need to go on to questions. I was also just thinking about very quickly about how a road trip is like, you know, it's a form of freedom, right? It's very American, right?
Yeah.
And anyway, so let's, I guess
We're going to move on to a Q&A since time is our most precious commodity. I didn't originate that quote. But if you'd like to ask questions of Jenny Odell and Cathy Hart-Pond, please raise your hand. I'm coming to you with a microphone. First, second, please go on.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts. My name is Vinita Goel. Among other things, I'm a writer as well. Cathy, I was wondering if you could maybe share the structure of the book in Minor Feelings. Was there a rising action and falling action, and how you structured your essays? It would be interesting to hear from you.
I mean, it was sort of, I didn't organize it, in such a way that there was, where there were like 3 acts, or there was like a, with a beginning and then right to a peak, and then there's a resolution. People said that's like, it's like the traditional narrative or arc or argumentative arc that's shaped like a phoenix, right? For a reason, right? It's a very kind of phallocentric way of thinking. And I was like, and for me, are you talking about the 2 essays, or are you talking about
The whole book, the structure.
the whole book? I mean, I think I started the essays out individually, so I started with the friendship essay, and then I was like, wait, there's still this idea that I want to explore. So then that would turn into another essay. So, or then like, or like for instance, when I was writing stand-up, I was like, there was all these kind of ideas about white innocence that sort of spilled over, and then I'm like, well, that could be another essay. So it kind of made sense that the end of white innocence would come right after stand-up. I would say the general kind of structure was that I wanted it to be, it was a kind of journey. This sounds sort of cheesy, but it was sort of a journey of decolonization. Like the journey of like sort of my own mind becoming decolonized in a way. Like it starts with these more like questions, doubts about the racial condition of being Asian American in America, and also people say, oh, it's about Asian American identity, but the book is also actually about America. The book is about America from an Asian American perspective. And so it was more, it started self-questioning, but then, and also kind of considering and interrogating sort of the kind of capitalist white supremacist society that we have lived in. And then towards the second half, there's a pivot, and I wanted to turn to kind of like your book, alternative models of community, friendship, ways of defining oneself that didn't have to do with shared harm, So, so that was sort of maybe as much of a structure as I could say.
All right.
It was. Yeah.
Question up front.
Yes, thank you. I guess it's more of a comment. Can you hear me? I was fascinated by your being in love with collages and how that spurred you on for non-linear writing. Because I'm in the beginnings of writing a book about small elephants in Africa, and I realize everybody's excited about it. But as I go, like, oh, you're there, so often, that thought I could, in my mind, just have collage, just see what comes out from it.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I always say that I think one of the most underrated parts of the writing process is sleep. And in part because I am an extremely light sleeper, I remember my dreams, and probably not all of them, I remember my dreams pretty much every night. And I mean, it's wild, like just the things that turn into other things, and like why is that? Why is there like a toilet in the middle of the department store? Just the juxtapositions of things, like both temporally and just like spatially, things being sort of in other things. And you can, if you think about it later, you can often kind of, sometimes you can see the logic where you're like, well, that person turned into that person because there's something about them that's the same or similar that I was not aware of in a conscious way. But even if you can't sort of like, I mean, get into the details, I think like I just have an appreciation for the sort of synthesis that can happen between things naturally without trying to force it, and just kind of like over time, like it's just things kind of getting like knitted together. And I think it's hard to trust that sometimes, especially if you have a deadline, but I think it's been sort of long enough that I do feel like you can lean on that a little bit.
We have a question in the back.
Hi. So one of the takeaways that I have from both of your works is that like, in order to resist standardization is also to resist against like a code of power. For example, like the code of good English, the code of standardized time in relation to capitalism. And something that I thought of was like, well, like the people who can do that are the people who are already marginalized and do not fit into that standardization, or the people who are privileged enough to have that conscious choice to be able to say, I don't like the system and I am in a position of power enough to be able to resist this. And so I guess my question is like, how do we find a way to expand that resistance to people who are not just already marginalized and people who are in a position of power who can consciously choose? So not just like the top 10% and the bottom 50%, but how do we get to the other parts of the people who might be in the middle, who are caught in these standardized systems, who don't want to change the systems?
I tend to think of it as like, I don't know, I almost envision it as like this kind of, like a fabric or a network, and there's a certain amount of slack or like space in it that is always being threatened. Like it's always like it's almost like the physics of it want to like shut that down. And so I feel like, you know, I don't know the full answer to that, but I know that part of it has to be that you don't give up any ground. So for example, like I feel like there are, I mean, this is a little bit different from what you're talking about, but there are writers who have written in a way that was not standardized, that maybe doesn't like adhere to like marketing logic, and they're sort of taking a risk by doing that. Like maybe it's not going to be legible, it's not going to sell well, or things like that. But because they've done that, it makes space for me to do that. And I've felt that as a writer, like someone else kept the space open for me, and so therefore I have a responsibility to keep the space as open as I can, given my circumstances, for others. And I think obviously you can do more with that when you are doing that in a collective way. Also, like you've made a decision, we, this group, are going to keep the space open. But I think like there's just this kind of idea of like not giving up ground before you have to, and kind of making that calculation for yourself.
I don't think I proposed anything as prescriptive as that in my book about like being about like saying about language, about just like, you know, resisting a standardized form of power. I definitely understand where your question is coming from. There's just a lot of different ways to, are we talking about writing? Are we talking about organizing? Are we talking about, you know, travel? Or, you know, I think it depends on the context you're talking about. Like, so let's say for Minor Feelings, if we're talking about the racial identity of Asian Americans, right? This is one of the, you know, what I often think, you know, first of all, when I think about Asian Americans, like people get so caught up on the fact that it's an identity, right? And that it's whether they belong to that identity or they don't belong to that identity. And and there's a lot of vying for competing narratives of what Asian America is. And usually the narrative that ends up dominating is the narrative that is either the model minority dominant, like Silicon Valley, all of that, or it's people just saying, oh, that makes me uncomfortable, you know, that kind of sort of, that's accused as quote unquote vocal liberalism or whatever. And I think, you know, I try not to give anything. I think it's like, you know, I agree with Jenny, it's about making a space, but if we're talking about, like, you know, I'm just gonna talk about this from minor, you know, what I was writing in minor feelings. In truly engage with what Asian America is to not think of it less as an identity, but more as this like, as a coalition, as a political coalition. And because that is what it is. It's not ontological. It's not like it doesn't really explain my being. It's much more practical than that. So if we see it as that, as something that's not defining and that's not predetermined, then I think there's more air and more porousness to think about, okay, what groups are being underrepresented. And I think that there is a tendency, especially in media, to kind of center the most successful Asian Americans, or to complain. It's either to complain or center the most successful Asian Americans, when it really should be centering the most vulnerable Asian Americans, you know, the most vulnerable. And I think this idea of what Asian American is should be very expansive. So it's like there's this ongoing discussion right now about like, okay, like with Palestine, right? Like why Asia, you know, Palestine is in Asia, right? Like why are they not connected to whatever Asian American cause there is here, and especially since, and Tanya was talking about this as well, especially since, like, you know, Edward Said's Orientalism is core to the way we think about Asian America and so forth. So it's like, I think for me, like, you know, I'm a writer, you know, I keep saying this, I'm a writer, not an activist, so I can't give any sort of like concrete examples of how we could do this, but I think what's really important is that, you know, we think of our experiences in terms of solidarity or affinities or connections. We should think of ourselves more in terms of our shared, instead of like where our point of origin, you know, rather than our point of origin, more we should think of how we are connected from shared exile in a way. And then go from there, you know. But anyway, I just sort of, but it's a very good question and something that I think about all the time.
Question on the right.
Hi, testing. Hi, my name is Lynn. I actually found out about this through Instagram. So I have a question for both of you guys about both minor feelings and same time and just a topic. I think with emotions and time, we've always had this aspect of like, I don't have time for that. And let's suppress it as much as we can. Even right before this today, I was talking to my best friend in Central Time. Hey, can we schedule a session so I can release some of my physical stress of emotions and everything? So I'm wondering in the work that you guys do, or just in practice for everyday interpersonal and both intrapersonally, how are you guys practicing that emotional care and towards yourself and towards others so that you are both recognizing and challenging the systems that are in place?
I definitely did not figure out how to do that while I was writing Saving Time. I can say that. I think it'll be, I'm hopeful that it'll be different this time around, the next book that I write, but I actually wasn't doing what you're talking about at all. And I feel like I was completely, again, this is during the pandemic, so that had a lot to do with it, but I felt extremely disembodied. I was just kind of like, I felt like I was just this kind of like vague perceptual being that was going through like a lot of academic papers and like different kinds of content, and not that there wasn't, you know, joy in that, like I liked doing that, but I was really not in touch with myself. And it really did not hit me until like right after I finished the book, like kind of everything hit me all at once. Like I was aware of the writer who was writing the thing, but I was not aware of the person that was being affected by the things that I was writing about, some of which were very upsetting to read about, like some of the histories that I was researching, you know, just like sitting with that, it's obviously gonna have some kind of effect on you. So I think that that's something that I'm like actively thinking about how to do and maintain, and I think, you know, some of it's been like, I've gotten really into bicycling. That's like huge. I have to, now if I'm gonna write for part of the day, I have to go on a bike ride. But I also have, I think, a better community of other writers who like just kind of like spending time with them, and the sort of the different kinds of pain that one encounters like when writing. I mean, I remember it was very therapeutic for me talking to the author Jess, who she has a oddly similar name to mine, Jess Nordell, who had just written The End of Bias, and we were talking about, or commiserating on the phone about how after a certain point of researching, you don't know if it's possible to actually know anything anymore. And so just like having, you know, someone else to kind of like just acknowledge that and sort of like talk about it, that's also been, you know, since writing Saving Time, it's been helpful. So those are some things that I have learned.
I think writing is self-care. Writing is emotional care, and writing is care towards others. And I think I don't, you know, I think I do provide that care to. I mean, I'm a parent. I'm a teacher. I'm a professor, and constantly, you know, I don't feel quite rooted in any kind of community yet here because I just moved to Berkeley, you know, a year ago. So I'm still kind of finding my own sort of belonging, you know. I feel in between, you know, New York and Berkeley right now, but I think, you know, there's so much demanded of you, especially as a woman of a certain age or a woman of any age, where you're supposed to be asked to give constantly, to give to, you know, whatever administrative tasks as a parent, as I think being being a professor in the classroom is entirely, I feel so, a lot of joy in that, because that's also a kind of care where we can really just engage in ideas, and poetry, and literature, and politics, and where we could really kind of respect each other's emotional needs as well. So that is care. But really, for me, if we're talking about this self-care, I don't like that term, but like, you know, care for oneself, it's really writing, and it's really just become writing, you know, because that's a place where I could really be myself and find a kind of order and meaning to this kind of 24-hour cyclone that we live in.
Thank you. To riff on that last question, thank you both for your works. And I think that both of your works bring us to a real sense of presence. Presence with distress. And when you're really present, you start to notice emotions, identities, and relationships that have been marginalized, suppressed, and subordinated. So my question is, how does hardship and joy, how do hardship and joy find their way into your professionalism and your personal lives?
Hardship and joy is also in the writing. I don't know. That's a good. I think we don't talk enough about joy. You know. Well, actually, you know, there has been a little bit more joy right now. I mean, I have a lot of mixed. That's another subject entirely. But you know, with this like sudden new election cycle, I think actually that's sort of they call it a vibe, right? Like that's like. You know, people are vibing in this joy. So, but I guess within the last 8 years, there's been a lot of distress, right? And and underneath that joy, there's also still distress happening in this country and elsewhere. I guess the joy that I do find is, are we talking about as a writer or just in terms of as a person? I mean, it's just as a person, I find joy in being a mother, you know, and being a friend, and being, you know, a partner, and it's the relationships around me. That's where I find joy, and also, you know, I'm someone who's a recent transplant, so it's like I'm learning to find joy in trying to learn joy in Northern California, and where there's joy is easy. It's funny because like a lot of people there's more joy here than in New York, but I find joy in like complaint. You know, like I find joy. That's my form of joy. This is different. Like people like these more like the forms of joy that you would expect to be joyful, like gardening and hiking and all of that, I don't find it joyful. So I'm trying to learn to find joy in that. I don't know. So yeah.
Okay, because my answer was going to be gardening. Which is actually very new. I have never gardened in my life. And I actually don't really, it's really just weeding. I never gardened in my life until like 3 months ago, but because I've never lived anywhere where I could have a garden, and I still don't have a garden, but I joined a native plant restoration volunteer group that meets every Sunday, and you know, initially I joined it because of, you know, the idea of native plant restoration, and I am interested in plants. I really am now just going for the people. Like, it's very clear. If I find out that I can't go for some reason, I get really grumpy. And the group, because of, you know, the nature of volunteering, the amount of time that it takes, it's almost entirely retired people and college students. I think I might be like the only person who's kind of in between those. But I don't know, there's just something, it's really beautiful up there. It's like in the East Bay Hills. And I just really like talking to the other people, and they have lots of corny jokes. We have like snack time afterwards. It's just like really, really lovely. So I would say that's a really big source of joy for me. But the other thing I would just mention is one of the things that I cite towards the end of the book is this children's book story that like haunted me ever since I read it as a child, from this book that my mom got me. Where basically a young boy is given a ball that you can pull thread out of, and if you pull it, time goes faster. And of course, he's like a little boy, so he like wants to be older, he wants to marry his crush. Like every time he thinks of something like that, he pulls it. You know, like he wants to get a job, he pulls it. He wants to get married, he pulls it. Of course, now like his life is over, and the witch who gave him the ball comes back and is like, "You've learned your lesson. Like, I will take the ball from you. You're now a little boy again." And it's like, well, that doesn't happen for us, for the rest of us. And so there's a lot of, I think, writing that chapter, which is the chapter that's set in the Chapel of the Chimes and is kind of like thinking about death. That was an opportunity for me to think about just kind of like the fact of being alive, which can like slip away from you so easily, and it can slip away from you from like months at a time in my experience. And so I would also say in a different way, like writing, I know I made it sound like it was not joyful for me in my last answer, but I do write in a journal. I mean, I don't know if something like a journal, and I have ever since I was in elementary school, and I really delight in like noting down sort of mundane details, and not mundane details, but just kind of like feeling that the things that you're experiencing and living are worth writing down, and that there's like a delight in experiencing them and also describing them.
Well, if there are no more questions, I want to say, just in addition to the illuminating ideas that we've shared with Jenny Odell and Cathy Park Hong, I would like to say, if you'd like to spend some more time at Mechanics Institute, you can come and read a book in the cushy chairs downstairs in the library. You can play a quiet or exciting game of chess down the hallway, or you can come to one of our events and turn off your cell phone for an hour and a half and enjoy this very precious time that we have to share ideas in civil discourse. And also, speaking of joy, get ready to vote. So with that, everyone, I would like to say thank you to Jenny and Kathy for a beautiful conversation. Books are on sale in the hallway, and they will be out there to sign your books, and we hope that you'll join us at our next events. Thank you.